Catherine Voss tapped her fingers against the glass table, eyes fixed on the man waiting near the door. Logan Shaw, her driver, a quiet man whose hands looked like they belonged to someone who had worked hard his entire life. She smiled at her colleagues and said something reckless. "If he dares to date my sister Violet even once, I will raise everyone's salary." No one believed Logan would agree. No one believed Violet would say yes. And no one, not even Catherine, understood what that single careless dare was about to unleash inside all three of their lives forever. Stay until the very end, because nothing about this story unfolds the way anyone, including Catherine, truly expects it to. Logan Shaw arrived at the office before 6 every morning, long before the building's lobby lights had finished warming up, long before the espresso machine on the 31st floor had been switched on by anyone else. He was 36 years old, broad-shouldered, soft-spoken, and almost invisible to the people who worked above him at Voss Capital Group. His job title, technically, was driver and personal assistant, though in practice it meant he carried bags, scheduled calendars, fetched coffee, and absorbed whatever frustration spilled over from executives who never bothered to learn his last name. He kept his shoes polished and his shirts pressed not because anyone demanded it, but because it was the only kind of order he still had full control over. Before leaving the apartment each morning, Logan always checked on his daughter Grace, 8 years old, still half asleep, her sneakers lined up neatly by the door the way he had taught her since she was small. He made her lunch in silence, packed it the same careful way every single day, and left a short note tucked inside her bag that she never mentioned finding but always quietly kept. Grace had grown used to a father who said very little about himself, who answered questions about her mother gently but briefly, and who carried something heavy behind his calm eyes that she had learned not to ask about. 3 years earlier, Logan had buried his wife, and in the months that followed, he had rebuilt his life from almost nothing, deliberately small, deliberately quiet, the kind of life that asked nothing of anyone and expected nothing in return. He moved through his days with a discipline that looked, to outsiders, like simple obedience, but was in fact something closer to control, the only form of control he still allowed himself to hold on to. Every morning, before the rest of the office arrived, Logan sat at a narrow desk near the parking garage entrance and reviewed the day's schedule with the same precision he once reserved for far larger numbers. In the bottom drawer of that desk, beneath old parking permits and a spare tie, sat a worn notebook filled with calculations, valuation models, and notes written in a tight, fast hand that no one at Voss Capital had ever bothered to glance at twice. To them, Logan Shaw was simply the man who opened car doors and remembered which executives liked their coffee black, the man who never complained when he was made to wait, the man who blended so completely into the background of the building that most employees could not have described his face if asked. None of them thought to ask why a driver would need a notebook full of numbers like that, and Logan never gave them a reason to wonder. He had learned, in the years since Chicago, that the safest place to hide a sharp mind was inside a job no one expected to require one, and he wore that disguise the way other men wore expensive suits, comfortably, deliberately, and without complaint. Occasionally, a junior associate would breeze past his desk without so much as a glance, dropping a folder for him to file or a dry cleaning ticket for him to collect, never once pausing to wonder whether the man accepting these small errands had ever stood inside a boardroom of his own. Logan never resented it the way he once might have, because resentment, he had learned, cost more energy than it returned, and energy was something he had decided to spend only on Grace and on the slow, careful project of rebuilding a life that no longer depended on anyone's approval. He answered every dismissive request with the same even politeness, collected the folder, delivered the dry cleaning, and went back to his narrow desk by the garage without a flicker of complaint crossing his face. There were moments, late in the evening when the office had emptied out and only the cleaning staff remained, when Logan allowed himself a few quiet minutes with that worn notebook, checking figures against numbers he had memorized out of old habit rather than any current need. He never let anyone see him doing it, not because he was ashamed of the old life still living somewhere inside him, but because he had not yet decided whether that life deserved to be let back out into the open. For now, it was enough to drive safely, arrive early, and watch the world of Voss Capital Group from the quiet, unremarkable distance of the driver's seat. Catherine Voss ran Voss Capital Group the way she ran every part of her life, with absolute control and very little patience for uncertainty. She was 39 years old, sharp-featured, immaculately put together, and widely regarded across the financial press as a woman who simply did not make mistakes. She had inherited the firm from her father a decade earlier, a modest regional investment house, and through sheer will had turned it into one of the most aggressive private capital groups on the East Coast. Where her father had been cautious, Catherine was relentless, and where he had trusted instinct, she trusted only numbers she had personally verified 3 times over. She did not dislike Logan exactly. To Catherine, he simply did not register as a person worth forming an opinion about, the same way she did not form opinions about the elevator or the revolving door. He drove well, he was punctual, and he never spoke unless spoken to first, which made him useful in the same uncomplicated way a reliable appliance was useful. She communicated with him almost entirely through short text messages, often leaving him waiting in silence for 20 minutes outside a restaurant without explanation, because it had simply never occurred to her that his time might be worth protecting. Catherine had built her entire career on the belief that people revealed their value through credentials, pedigree, and the right last name attached to the right institution, and nothing in Logan's file suggested he possessed any of those things. That she had hired him 2 years earlier based on a quiet recommendation from her head of security, who had vouched only for his discretion and his clean record, never once mentioning anything about his past beyond that. It had been enough for Catherine at the time, because a driver did not need a history, only reliability, and reliability was the one quality she had never had reason to question in him. Her father had built the original firm on careful, almost timid decisions, and Catherine had spent her entire childhood watching him hesitate at moments that, looking back, had cost the family millions of dollars in missed opportunities. She had promised herself, long before she ever sat behind his old desk, that she would never let caution slow her down the way it had slowed him, and for the most part that promise had served her well, multiplying the firm's holdings far beyond anything her father had managed in 3 decades. What it had not given her, though she rarely allowed herself to dwell on it, was very much of a life outside the office, a fact she covered with long hours and an unspoken assumption that work was simply what people like her did instead of everything else. She had not been on a real date herself in over a year, a detail she would have denied if anyone had been bold enough to ask, and some quiet, unexamined part of her resented how easily Violet seemed to attract affection she herself had stopped expecting. It was not jealousy exactly, Catherine told herself, only concern, the natural protectiveness of an older sister who had learned the hard way that charm without substance eventually crumbled under pressure. She rarely paused to consider that her own life, organized so completely around control and verification, might be missing something just as important as the qualities she kept demanding her sister find in someone else. On a Thursday afternoon, during a closed-door strategy meeting with 3 senior partners, Catherine's mind drifted, as it often did, to her younger sister. Violet had just ended her 3rd serious relationship in 2 years, each one collapsing under the same quiet pressure, a boyfriend who could not stand being introduced as the man dating a Voss. Catherine loved her sister fiercely, but her love came wrapped in judgment, the kind that masqueraded as concern. She wanted Violet to stop chasing handsome, hollow men who folded the moment things became difficult, and she said so bluntly in front of the entire room. One of the senior partners, a man named Caleb who had worked alongside Catherine for nearly 6 years, half-joked that what Violet really needed was someone painfully ordinary, someone with absolutely no interest in the Voss name or the Voss fortune. Catherine laughed, started to dismiss the idea, then happened to glance through the glass wall toward the hallway, where Logan stood waiting, patient as always, holding her coat over one arm. Something cold and amused settled behind her eyes, the particular look she got right before making a decision she would later insist had been entirely reasonable. The thought arrived fully formed, almost elegant in its cruelty, a perfect demonstration she could hand her sister wrapped in the appearance of a harmless favor. She walked out into the hallway and asked him, directly in front of the partners who had followed her to the doorway out of curiosity, whether he had been on a single date since his wife had passed. Logan's expression did not change. He answered simply that he had not. Catherine studied him for a moment the way she might study an unfamiliar asset before deciding whether it carried any value at all, and then made him an offer disguised as a request, the kind of offer that, coming from his employer, did not feel entirely optional. She wanted him to take her sister Violet to an art gallery opening that Friday evening, just once, nothing more, and in exchange she would arrange a bonus equal to 3 months of his salary. Caleb chuckled under his breath, and the other partners exchanged amused glances, assuming this was simply Catherine being Catherine, turning her sister's love life into another transaction to be optimized like everything else she touched. Logan asked quietly whether Violet herself had agreed to this arrangement, a question that visibly caught Catherine off guard, as though it had not occurred to her that her sister's consent might be a separate matter from her own decision. Catherine answered, a little too quickly, that Violet would be fine with it, that she always agreed to things eventually once Catherine explained the reasoning behind them clearly enough. Logan said nothing to that, only held her gaze a moment longer than was comfortable, and something about his silence made one of the other partners shift uneasily in his seat, as though the joke had quietly stopped being funny without anyone announcing it out loud. What none of them expected, including Catherine herself, was the long, steady silence that followed after that exchange, or the calm in Logan's voice when he finally answered that he would go, but that he did not need the money. The room went quiet in a different way after that. It was not defiance exactly. Nothing in his posture suggested rebellion, but there was something in the simplicity of his refusal that Catherine could not immediately categorize. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she found herself uncertain about a decision she herself had made only moments earlier. She covered the feeling quickly, the way she covered every uncomfortable feeling, with a brisk nod and a return to the conference room, already half convinced the entire exchange had meant nothing at all. Caleb caught her eye briefly as the meeting resumed, a small, curious smile still lingering on his face, though he said nothing further about it. Violet Voss received the phone call from her sister later that same afternoon, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the small gallery she curated in Lower Manhattan, surrounded by crates of unopened artwork waiting to be hung. Catherine's voice on the line was light, almost careless, the way it always was when she was being least honest about her intentions. "He's just my driver," she said. "Simple, uncomplicated, nothing for you to overthink." Violet, 31 years old and exhausted by a long string of men who had been anything but simple, found herself agreeing before she had fully decided to. Part of her recognized exactly what her sister was doing, dressing up another quiet test as an innocent favor, the same way Catherine had been doing since they were teenagers. Ever since Violet brought home her very first boyfriend and watched Catherine dismantle him politely over dinner without raising her voice once. Her most recent relationship with a hedge fund associate named Hunter, who had seemed confident enough at first, had ended after he admitted, almost sheepishly, that he found it exhausting being measured constantly against Catherine's standards, even when Catherine herself said nothing at all. Violet had not cried over that one, only felt a familiar, tired sense of déjà vu, the sense that she kept attracting men who were impressed by her name long before they were genuinely curious about her. And yet there was something almost refreshing in the idea of an evening with someone who had absolutely nothing to gain by impressing her, no family business to inherit, no social circle to maintain, no agenda hidden beneath good manners. Violet told herself it would be one evening, easily forgotten, and went back to unpacking crates without giving it much more thought, though some small, unguarded part of her found herself oddly curious about what kind of person agreed to a blind favor for his employer without complaint. She met Logan in person 2 days later, in the marble lobby of Voss Capital Group, where he stood waiting near the security desk in a clean dark blue shirt. No expensive suit, no obvious effort to impress anyone. While he waited for her to finish signing a delivery form for the gallery, Violet noticed the worn hardcover book tucked under his arm, dense, academic, the kind of book people read because they were genuinely curious, not the kind people carried around to look intelligent in front of strangers. She glanced at the title twice before deciding not to ask about it yet, filing the small detail away the way she filed away interesting brushstrokes on a canvas, something to return to later. Their first real exchange was brief, almost nothing, a handful of sentences about traffic and the weather, yet something in his tone caught her attention. When he asked about the gallery opening, his curiosity sounded entirely genuine, not the polite performative interest she was used to from men trying to seem thoughtful in front of a woman they wanted something from. Violet found herself answering more fully than the question required, describing the artist, the theme of the show, the long argument she'd had with the building's contractor about lighting, and Logan listened the way very few people ever did, without checking his phone, without waiting for his turn to talk about himself instead. The gallery opening that Friday evening filled quickly with the usual crowd, financiers and collectors and a handful of genuine artists drifting awkwardly between conversations about money disguised as conversations about culture. Logan arrived precisely on time, dressed simply, and offered his arm to Violet without ceremony as they stepped inside beneath the gallery's high white walls. A few familiar faces turned to look, the kind of subtle, assessing glance Violet had grown used to receiving her entire adult life, though this time, the question hovering behind their eyes was clearly aimed at her companion instead. Violet introduced him only by his first name, no title, no explanation, and Logan accepted the lack of context without a flicker of discomfort. They stopped first in front of a large abstract canvas valued, according to the small card beside it, at well over $2 million. Logan studied it for a long moment in silence, then made a quiet observation about the way the artist had used empty space to create visual pressure rather than relief. An observation that sounded less like small talk and more like something pulled from years of genuine study. Violet turned to look at him fully for the first time that evening, surprised because that particular insight was not something casual visitors picked up from a brief glance at a wall placard, and she found herself asking, almost without meaning to, where he had learned to look at paintings that way. He answered simply that his late wife had loved museums, and that he had spent enough quiet Sunday afternoons standing beside her in front of canvases like this one to absorb more than he had ever realized at the time. Violet did not push further, sensing the careful weight behind the sentence, and instead let the silence settle naturally between them as they moved on to the next piece. As they continued slowly through the gallery, piece by piece, Logan said very little, but everything he did say landed with unusual precision, and Violet noticed herself talking more than she normally allowed herself to with strangers, drawn out by the simple fact that he seemed to actually be listening. In front of a small bronze sculpture near the back wall, Violet mentioned, half joking, that most of the guests in the room had no real opinion of the piece beyond its price tag, and that she sometimes wondered why she bothered curating shows for an audience that mostly wanted to be photographed beside the art rather than look at it. Logan considered the question seriously rather than offering an easy compliment, and told her that perhaps the work mattered regardless of who was watching, that a piece could still be true even if most of the room missed the point of it entirely. Violet stopped walking for a moment, struck by how naturally the remark had landed, exactly the reassurance she had not realized she needed to hear that particular evening. Partway through the evening, one of Catherine's longtime business associates, a tall, silver-haired investor named Wyatt, spotted them across the room and did a visible double take at the sight of Logan in a setting like this. Wyatt's eyes lingered a beat too long, recognition flickering somewhere behind his polite smile, but he said nothing, only offered a brief nod before turning quickly back toward his own conversation. Violet noticed the strange hesitation, the way Wyatt's expression had shifted from confusion to something closer to caution, and filed it away beside the worn academic book and the careful, deliberate way Logan moved through a room full of money without ever seeming impressed by it. When the evening ended and Logan walked her to her car, Violet finally asked the question that had been sitting in the back of her mind since the phone call from her sister. She asked, directly, whether he had agreed to come because of the bonus Catherine had offered. Logan answered without hesitation that he had not, that the money was still sitting wherever Catherine intended to put it, because he had never wanted it in the first place. When Violet pressed further, asking why he had come at all, his answer was simple and unguarded, that he had wanted to get out of his usual routine for an evening, and that he had thought she might be interesting to talk to. There was nothing rehearsed in the way he said it, nothing calculated, and Violet realized with some surprise that she could not remember the last time a man had told her something so plainly true. The following morning, Violet called her sister expecting to deliver a brief, dismissive report that would close the subject entirely, but instead found herself describing the evening in more detail than she had intended, her voice carrying a warmth that Catherine had not heard from her in a long time. Catherine listened with a tightening sense of unease, because this was not the outcome she had quietly expected when she arranged the entire evening as a kind of pointed lesson. She had wanted Violet to see, clearly and uncomfortably, the gap between her world and a man like Logan's, and instead her sister sounded almost happy, almost lighter than she had in months. By that afternoon, Catherine had summoned Logan into her office, closing the door behind him with a deliberate click. She informed him, in the clipped, efficient tone she used for terminating underperforming contracts, that the evening had served its purpose and there was no need for any further contact with her sister. Logan met her gaze steadily and told her, without raising his voice, that Violet had not said anything resembling that to him. Catherine reminded him, somewhat sharply, of exactly whose paycheck he depended on, and Logan answered that if she wished to end his employment over the matter, that was entirely her right, but that Violet was a grown woman capable of making her own decisions. Frustrated and unsettled by an exchange that had not gone the way authority usually went in that office, Catherine began quietly digging into Logan's background that same week, starting with a handful of discreet calls to people who had once worked alongside him at the firm. What she found, or rather failed to find, only deepened her unease because his employment file listed no university degree, no prior references in finance, and no professional network of any kind that she could trace through the usual channels. And yet something about the calm precision in his voice during their last conversation did not match the profile of an ordinary driver at all, and the more she sat with that contradiction, the more it bothered her. Meanwhile, Violet had begun calling Logan for reasons that had nothing to do with romance, at least on the surface, asking his opinion on a contract she was considering for a major new exhibition partnership with a gallery in another city. Logan read through the document she emailed him late one evening, and the next morning sent back 3 specific concerns about indemnification clauses, written in precise, almost legal language that no casual observer would have noticed buried in dense paragraphs of boilerplate text. Violet read his notes twice, then sat back in her chair for a long moment, quietly recalculating everything she thought she understood about the man her sister had dismissed so easily as nothing more than convenient and harmless. Over the following 2 weeks, Logan and Violet continued to find small, almost accidental reasons to see each other, never quite calling it dating, though it had clearly become something more than a single arranged evening. She stopped by the modest garage near his apartment one Saturday afternoon, where he spent weekends restoring an old sedan purely for the satisfaction of the work, and watched him explain torque specifications with the same calm fluency he had used to discuss abstract art weeks earlier. Grease streaked across his forearms, sleeves rolled up, and for a moment Violet thought he looked more at home here, hands buried in an engine, than he ever had standing in pressed shirts inside her sister's marble lobby. She asked him, half teasing, whether there was anything he was not quietly good at, and Logan considered the question seriously for a moment before admitting that he had never learned to dance properly, something his late wife had spent years trying and failing to teach him. The admission made Violet laugh for the first time that afternoon, a real laugh, unguarded, and Logan smiled back at her with an ease that surprised them both, neither one quite expecting a garage full of spare parts to feel this comfortable. She began noticing other small inconsistencies too, the way he recognized the names of obscure investment firms mentioned casually on the radio, the way he once referenced, almost in passing, a winter spent in Chicago that sounded nothing like the life of a man who had only ever driven cars for other people. Inside Voss Capital Group, a senior analyst named Mason happened to glance over Logan's shoulder one afternoon while he was reviewing a printed report at his small desk near the garage entrance, and froze for a moment at what he saw written in the margins. The annotations followed a valuation methodology Mason recognized from a now-defunct Chicago investment firm whose collapse had made headlines years earlier, a methodology not taught in business schools, only learned by people who had actually built and broken funds using it firsthand. Mason said nothing in the moment, embarrassed by his own curiosity, but he looked at Logan differently from that day forward, with a kind of cautious respect he could not quite explain to himself or to anyone else in the office. Around that same time, Wyatt, the silver-haired investor who had recognized something familiar in Logan at the gallery weeks earlier, mentioned the encounter to Catherine almost in passing during an unrelated phone call about quarterly projections. He admitted he could not place exactly where he knew the face from, only that something about the man's bearing reminded him of a name connected to a messy Chicago fund collapse he had read about years before, though he could not for the life of him recall the details. Catherine thanked him politely and hung up the phone slowly. The small, unplaceable remark, settling uncomfortably alongside everything else that had started to feel slightly out of order in her carefully managed world. Catherine, growing increasingly uneasy, eventually hired a private researcher named Jason, a careful, methodical man she had used before for background checks on potential business partners, to dig deeper than casual phone calls could reach. He returned within days with a short report containing a single startling detail delivered to her in person across her own desk with the particular caution of someone who suspected his client would not like what she was about to read. Years earlier, a man named Logan Ashford Shaw had been named in a sealed corporate lawsuit filed in Chicago, though the records themselves remained locked behind a confidentiality order that the researcher could not break through no matter how many contacts he tried. He told her plainly that whatever had happened in that courtroom had been significant enough to warrant a permanent seal, the kind reserved for cases involving substantial sums or reputations that powerful people wanted kept quiet. Catherine stared at the name on the page for a long time, the unfamiliar middle name sitting strangely beside the man she thought she had fully categorized the moment she met him. And for the first time in this entire affair, she felt something closer to genuine alarm than irritation. She dismissed the researcher, sat alone in her office long after he had gone, and found herself, despite every instinct telling her not to, replaying every quiet, unremarkable interaction she had ever had with Logan Shaw in a completely different light. Violet confronted Logan directly rather than waiting for her sister to uncover the rest on her own, arriving at his apartment one evening, after Grace had already gone to bed, and placing a single printed page on his kitchen table with the name Logan Ashford Shaw typed plainly across the top. Logan looked at the page for a long moment, then poured 2 cups of coffee without any visible panic, set one in front of her, and finally began to speak, his voice low and steady, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this explanation in his head many times without ever expecting to need it. He told her, calmly and without self-pity, that years earlier he had co-founded and served as chief investment officer of a private fund based in Chicago, one that had once managed assets worth well over $1 billion, a fact that sounded almost unreal sitting across a kitchen table from him in this small, modest apartment. He explained that his closest business partner at the time, a man named Adrian Cole, someone he had trusted completely, had quietly fabricated documents in an attempt to seize full control of the fund, dragging Logan into a brutal corporate lawsuit that stretched on for 14 long months. Though Logan eventually won the case and cleared his name entirely, the victory came at a devastating cost, because during those same 14 months his wife had grown seriously ill, and by the time the lawsuit ended, there had been no time left to properly notice how sick she truly was. He paused there, turning his coffee cup slowly between his hands, and told Violet that he had spent years afterward wondering whether a different version of himself, one less consumed by depositions and court filings, might have noticed the warning signs sooner, might have had more time with her than the handful of difficult months they were eventually left with. Violet did not offer any easy comfort to that, only let it sit in the room between them, sensing that he had not told this part of the story to many people and did not need her to fix it, only to hear it. After her death, Logan sold his remaining stake in the fund, left Chicago entirely, and deliberately built a smaller, quieter life from almost nothing, not because he had been defeated, but because he no longer wanted any part of the world that had cost him so much. The meetings, the lawyers, the numbers that mattered more to everyone else than the people standing behind them. He told her that Grace had been only 5 years old at the time, too young to understand most of it, and that watching her grow steadily in this smaller, quieter life had been the one thing that convinced him he had made the right choice in walking away from everything he used to be. He told Violet that his arrival at Voss Capital Group had not been entirely random either, explaining quietly that Adrian Cole was now attempting to broker a merger deal with her sister's firm, the very same man whose fabricated documents had once nearly destroyed Logan's career and reputation years earlier. Logan had taken the modest driving position specifically to watch the deal unfold from the inside, to gather enough verified information to stop Catherine from signing an agreement that would eventually hollow out everything she had spent a decade building, the way it had once hollowed out everything he had built in Chicago. Violet sat in silence for a long moment after he finished, processing the careful, deliberate patience behind everything he had done, then finally asked why he had never simply told her sister the truth from the very beginning, instead of waiting and watching from the shadows of her own company. Logan's answer was quiet and direct, that Catherine would never have listened to a warning from a man she had already decided was beneath her attention, and that he needed her to see the facts laid out clearly before she could possibly see him as anything more than the help. Violet reached across the table and rested her hand briefly over his, not as a grand gesture, only as a small acknowledgement that she finally understood the full shape of who he was. The next morning, Violet went straight to her sister's office and asked her, without preamble, to delay the signing ceremony scheduled for that coming week with her prospective merger partner. Catherine refused immediately, citing months of careful negotiation and the considerable money already spent on lawyers and due diligence, but Violet did not leave, setting a small drive on the desk between them instead and saying simply that there was something Logan Shaw wanted her to see first. Catherine opened the files reluctantly, expecting nothing more than a desperate distraction, and instead found a 47-page financial analysis laying out, in precise and unmistakable detail, hidden liabilities buried inside the merger structure, weak points in the proposed governance terms, and documented evidence of fraud connected directly to Adrian Cole, the very partner she had spent months courting. She called Logan into her office immediately, and for the first time since they had met, she looked at him without the dismissive certainty that had defined every previous interaction between them. He walked her through the findings calmly, point by point, never raising his voice, even when she interrupted him twice, with sharp, defensive questions, answering each challenge with another piece of verified data rather than emotion. When Catherine demanded to know how he had managed to compile such a thorough analysis without access to the firm's internal systems, Logan reminded her quietly that he had spent 2 years driving her to every meeting connected to this deal, present in rooms where people often forgot a driver could hear, let alone understand, what was being discussed around him. Caleb sat quietly in the corner of the room throughout, watching the exchange with growing astonishment, recognizing, perhaps faster than Catherine herself, exactly what kind of mind they had been overlooking for 2 years. At one point, Caleb leaned forward and asked Logan a pointed technical question about one of the governance clauses, half expecting to catch him in a gap, and Logan answered it so completely and so quickly that Caleb simply sat back again without another word, a faint, disbelieving smile crossing his face. By the end of the meeting, Catherine had quietly canceled the signing ceremony entirely, and Adrian Cole, sensing the shift the moment he walked into the building and saw the mood in the room, departed citing only a vague need for further review, though everyone present understood exactly what that really meant. Once the office had emptied out and the two of them were finally alone, Catherine asked Logan, in a voice stripped of its usual authority, why he had not simply come to her directly the moment he started working there instead of waiting 2 long years to act. Logan answered honestly that she had already decided who he was the very first moment she saw him standing by that door, and that he had needed her to see the numbers clearly before she could possibly see him as anything more than a driver who carried her coat and remembered her coffee order. Catherine had no immediate response to that, and for several long seconds she simply stood there in the quiet of her own office, recalculating, for what felt like the first time in years, a judgment she had made far too quickly and never once thought to question. Logan submitted his resignation the following day, not out of anger, and not because anyone had asked him to leave, but because, as he told Catherine plainly, his purpose there had been served the moment the merger was stopped and the truth had finally been laid out in the open. Catherine did not accept the resignation right away, holding the paper on her desk for nearly a full week, not out of guilt exactly, but because she recognized, with newfound clarity, the genuine value of someone who understood risk the way Logan did, far better than anyone currently on her payroll. She eventually offered him a position as an independent risk advisor for the firm, a role built specifically around his skills rather than around any debt she felt she owed him, a distinction that mattered enormously to both of them and one she made a point of saying out loud. Logan read the offer carefully, folded it once, and told her simply that he would think about it, an answer that was neither acceptance nor refusal, but the calm boundary of a man who finally understood his own worth and intended to protect it from this point forward. In the days that followed, Catherine found herself doing something she rarely allowed, sitting with an uncomfortable question rather than immediately resolving it with another decision. She had spent her entire career certain that she could measure a person's worth within minutes of meeting them, and Logan Shaw had quietly proven her wrong without ever once raising his voice to make the point. She did not announce this realization to anyone, not even Violet, but it settled into her all the same, reshaping, slowly and without ceremony, the way she looked at every quiet, overlooked person in her building from that point forward. Violet and Logan continued seeing each other in the weeks that followed, never rushing toward any grand declaration, content instead with quiet dinners, long walks, and the easy comfort of two people who had stopped pretending to be anyone other than themselves. Grace met Violet for the first time over a simple Sunday breakfast, curious but unhurried, asking careful, direct questions the way only children do, wanting to know whether Violet liked pancakes and whether she had ever met a real artist in person. Violet answered each question patiently and watched the two adults talk easily across the table without the careful tension she sometimes noticed in her father around new people, deciding quietly, in the private way children decide things, that she approved. Later that same afternoon, while Logan washed dishes in the small kitchen, Grace pulled Violet aside with the particular seriousness of an 8-year-old delivering important information, and told her that her father almost never smiled like that around anyone new, as though this were a fact Violet needed to know before going any further. Violet thanked her solemnly, matching the gravity of the moment, and felt something settle quietly into place inside her own chest. A sense that whatever this was becoming, it was being built on something steadier than the relationship she had grown used to losing. One evening, standing together in the gallery during the opening of a new exhibition Violet herself had curated, she asked him what he thought he might do next, now that the merger was dead and his old name had finally surfaced into the light after all these years. Logan looked slowly around the room before answering that he thought he might stay in the city a little while longer, that there did not seem to be any particular reason to rush toward whatever came after this. There was no dramatic kiss in that moment, no sweeping declaration of love, only Logan standing quietly beside Violet in front of a painting neither of them had seen before, both of them simply at ease, neither in a hurry to be anywhere else. Across town, Catherine sat alone in her office long after everyone else had gone home, Logan's folded offer still sitting on the corner of her desk, and found herself, for once, in no rush to demand an answer. None of the three of them, not Catherine, not Violet, and not Logan himself, ever fully realized that the reckless little dare made in a glass conference room weeks earlier, the one moment when all three of them had been so certain they understood exactly how it would end, turned out to be the only night none of them had been right at all.